Hi, my name is Rosie Davidson, and I was assigned Chapter 4 in About Behaviorism by B.F. Skinner. Skinner sums up operant conditioning into one sentence. When a bit of behavior has the kind of consequence called reinforcing, it is more likely to occur again. To summarize, reinforcement is anything that strengthens a behavior, and there are two types of reinforcement, positive and negative. Positive reinforcement is adding any stimulus that will increase the likelihood of the behavior happening again in the future, and negative reinforcement is removing any unwanted stimulus, which again will increase the likelihood of that behavior happening in the future. Examples of positive reinforcement are if the child responds appropriately to an SD or a demand, then we can give the child a preferred item or let them do a preferred activity, and because we let them do something or we gave them a preferred item, it's considered positive reinforcement because we added a stimulus that they like and will hopefully increase the likelihood of this happening in the future. And same thing with negative reinforcement. If they respond appropriately to a demand or an SD, we can take away a stimulus that they don't like. If music is playing in the background and the kiddo doesn't like music, we can turn the music off, and this will hopefully increase the likelihood of that same response or behavior happening again in the future. Humans and other animals use operant conditioning and reinforcement to survive. Reinforcement takes on a different why when in nature or survival mode. Typically, reinforcement feels, looks, sounds, smells, or tastes good. It satisfies one or more of our five senses. But through an evolutionary lens or survival standpoint, reinforcement becomes about survival value and how well it will help us, or how likely it is to help us survive. It doesn't satisfy it doesn't have to satisfy any of the five senses. Skinner uses the example of sexual reinforcement for survival value. He explains that a potential mate typically aims for the more skillful or powerful member of the opposite sex in order for the species to continue. Some of the members need to be susceptible to sexual reinforcement because not everybody is susceptible or reinforced by the same things. So at least some of the members of a society or a species need to be reinforced by sexual gratification. Because with the case of sexual reinforcement, it allows for a species or a specific family to continue, and that is the reinforcement from that stimulus. Without this, the human species or any other species would have died out a long time ago. Another factor to consider when choosing a reinforcer is the deprivation or satiation level of that reinforcement. Deprivation is going without something for a period of time, and satiation is having something for immediately before you're going to use it as reinforcement. If a child has unlimited access to Oreos, for example, throughout their day, and you try to use it as a reinforcement while you're working with them, the likelihood of the Oreos working as a motivator are not very high. Whereas if the child only has access to Oreos during session with you or while they're working with you, their motivation is much more likely, is likely to be higher because they don't have access to Oreos whenever they want. A child can also become satiated while you're working with them if you're only using 1 or 2 reinforcers. So to prevent this, we can use preference assessments, which is offering 2 or 3 different items that the child can choose, and then we know that they are motivated and will be reinforced by this item or activity. Skinner then goes in to talk about determinism versus free will. Determinism is that an organism does not have free will and can only act or will only act by external causes. Free will is when an organism can choose to act or not act, separate from external causes. While a person's history does give a probability of them acting a certain way in certain situations in the future, even when those scenarios are not, or those factors are not conspicuous, does not mean that the individual is not able to choose the less probable outcome. The probability Skinner writes about is directly related to the reinforcer. The first example that came to my mind was choosing to go to work every day. A lot of people, especially when we have to wake up early for work, want to stay in bed, but we choose to go to work because of keeping our job and a paycheck as reinforcement. Typically, that reinforcement or the paycheck is much stronger than the want to stay in bed. So therefore, we can usually predict that people are going to get up and go to work. But that does not mean that a person can't exercise their free will to stay in bed, which will eventually result in them losing their job if they do it too often. Skinner goes on again to explain that while motives and purposes are internal, they are still controlled or affected by consequences, external consequences, which are in the world of fact, as in we can see them and observe them and measure them. This relates back to the work example because most people are motivated to go to work because of the extrinsic factor of a paycheck and keeping our job. However, I question this point when it comes to new experiences because we don't know the consequences and we don't know if they will be reinforcing to us. However, some could argue that the unknown or the surprise acts as the reinforcer. Humans typically cite feelings for the why of a behavior rather than what extrinsic event caused those feelings. One example Skinner gave that I could relate to is homesickness. Someone becomes homesick because they move away and are now no longer able to return home or partake in behaviors related to being home, which then results in the feeling of being homesick. Punishment is the opposite of reinforcement in that it is a stimuli that lessens or decreases the likelihood of a behavior happening in the future. There's also positive and negative punishment. Positive punishment is, again, adding a stimuli that will decrease the behavior from happening in the future, and negative stimuli is taking away something that will decrease that behavior in the future. For example, a positive punishment would be adding noise-canceling headphones to stop a child with autism from stimming. And a negative punishment would be taking away a tablet. Skinner then goes on to talk about structuralism, which focuses on the form of a behavior or how a behavior looks, and not why it is happening. The earliest structuralist thoughts were a behavior is nothing more than a muscle twitch. One structuralist principle is habit formation, simply becoming accustomed to behaving in a specific way and ignoring reinforcement contingencies. Example, in ancient Greece, they used structuralism in their court systems to determine if somebody was guilty of a crime. So if somebody murdered another person, even if it was in self-defense, they are guilty of murder, regardless of why they did it, simply because they did the act of murdering somebody else. To sum up structuralism, it is simply what you do, not why you did it. And finally, at the end of the chapter, Skinner quotes, "Nothing proves men in modern societies are happier than men in archaic societies, because operant reinforcement has some effectiveness in both eras, regardless of what the reinforcement is. Men and women are still being reinforced in both time periods." Do you agree with this thought or this statement?